Israel's dramatic rescue of 4 hostages from inside the Gaza Strip in an operation that health officials say killed 274 Palestinians comes at a sensitive time in the 8-month-old war. Israel and Hamas are weighing an American-backed proposal for a ceasefire and the release of the remaining captives. Both sides face renewed pressure to make a deal. For Israel, the complex rescue may be unlikely to be replicated on a scale needed to bring back the remaining hostages. And Hamas now has 4 fewer bargaining chips. But they could also dig in, as they repeatedly have, over months of indirect negotiations mediated by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. Joining us now from Israel to discuss the terms of the ceasefire proposal is former hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin. Gershon, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Can you walk us through the specifics of what the proposed ceasefire deal entails?
What we know is what President Biden presented in his press conference, where he told us that it was an Israeli deal supported by Prime Minister Netanyahu, which involves a 6-week ceasefire during which time 18 hostages who fit into the humanitarian category, meaning women, including girl soldiers, wounded and elderly, would be released. Negotiations would continue throughout the 6-week ceasefire period to phase 2, which would include a release of additional hostages, while Israel is also releasing Palestinian prisoners in phase 1 and phase 2. President Biden seemed to let us understand that the 6-week ceasefire would continue into phase 2, even if agreement wasn't reached. And by phase 3, all the hostages are supposed to be returned to Israel, including dead hostages. And Israel would release more Palestinian prisoners, and presumably the war would come to an end. There are a lot of things that are not known, a lot of unclear details. What is perfectly clear is that from the Hamas perspective, there is no deal without an Israeli commitment to end the war. And from Israel's perspective, there is no deal which includes the end of the war. And this is where we have the perhaps unbridgeable gap between the two parties.
And how does the rescue operation play into the equation? Does the ability to rescue hostages by force help or hurt the negotiation process?
I'm not sure they have a big impact. They may have an immediate impact for a few days, during which time the Israeli prime minister is being told by members of his cabinet and members of the public that Israel should pursue more rescue operations, which they are. I'm sure that they're planning and searching and trying to collect intelligence information, but we're dealing with 120 hostages, and there is no way that Israel is able to rescue them all. The only way they can all be returned is through a negotiated deal with Hamas. I'm sure that following the rescue operation, Hamas is probably moving hostages around. Perhaps hostages who were above ground, as the 4 who were rescued are now underground in tunnels. I would assume that they have re-inspected their own internal systems for guarding them and making sure that intelligence information is not released. I would imagine that the situation of the hostages has not improved since the rescue operation.
How does the resignation of Benny Gantz come into play here? Can you explain his objections to how Netanyahu is handling the war, and what do you make of his objections?
Primarily, the objections of Benny Gantz and the members of his party is that there is no strategy for the day after the war. There's this loose concept that Netanyahu has said of total victory. There's no such thing as a total victory. Gantz and his party were saying Israel needs to have a day after strategy for who's going to replace Hamas as the governing body in Gaza, whether it be from the Palestinian Authority, from other Palestinian groups. It must be Palestinian-led, and Mr. Netanyahu has refused to deal with any coherent, rational, possible, viable day after strategy. So the war goes on, and Gantz and members of his party believe that Netanyahu is prolonging the war simply to prolong his own political lifeline.
And do we have a timeline of when some sort of decision will be made?
Well, Gantz announced his withdrawal from the government last night. His party has left the government. They are now officially part of the opposition once again. It doesn't bring down the Israeli government. Netanyahu still has a clear majority of 64 seats in the 120-member parliament. But I assume that with Gantz in the opposition, which has been the party most popular in the polls, we're going to see a quite large increase in the number of Israelis taking to the streets to demonstrate for a deal on the hostages and for new elections.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.